I wish I was rage baiting.
Get your pitchforks ready, people, because these takes are coming in hot. 2023 has been a big year for sequels, some of the most notable being Tears of the Kingdom and Spider-Man 2. And I like them a lot, but I just can't shake this cloud of disappointment over my head. Both of the original games are some of my favorites that I've played in the last few years, which means that for reasons entirely out of the developer's control, my expectations were too high. Because I wanted the sequels to make me feel the same magic I did years ago. Both of these games are better than the previous games on almost every objective metric that you could apply, but I still like the originals more. But in a few years when I come back to these games, I think I'll love them, because sequels are better in retrospect. Here's the thing about sequels. While no games are free from the burden of expectations, sequels are slaves to them because of that direct relationship to a previous game. Sequels are expected to expand upon the previous game, and they can't take things too far, or you'll lose what made the first one special. But if the game is too similar, people will throw a fit because they've already played this game. And everybody wants something different from a sequel. It is impossible to please everyone. And more than ever, the pressure is on because gamers feel like they are owed something in a sequel. Fresh IPs or reboots have to contend with this perceived debt way less because the consumer base views them more like an offering or a gift. But a sequel, well, that's for us.
You will make it because we want it. And you will make it like we want it because you owe that to us. Because we are the loyal fans. This pressure is unfair.
But it is, unfortunately, inescapable. It dominates the discourse and does have sway over board members and publishing execs. Ultimately, I think developers make the game that they want much more than people realize, but the point of bringing this up is that when a new sequel releases, there is so much toxic discourse that drags down the release of the game. Great reviews, high sales, it's all overshadowed by the beast that is Twitter. None of this is all that important because the vocal minority is just that, and especially in the case of Spider-Man 2, the game has sold like lightning. And I don't think Insomniac or Sony are all that concerned with what Nutcruncher678 on Reddit thinks that they've done wrong, or that egofish__ thinks they've ruined the franchise. But it is important to the gamers. A lot of the discourse is dominated by rage bait and console war foot soldiers, but I think that there is an underlying group of people that feel the way I do. That the game is good in every critical way, but it's just not doing it for me right now. At least, not as much as I'd hoped. It is still really fun. Let's take a step back though. We'll come back to Spider-Man and Tears of the Kingdom soon, but let's start by looking back at Skyward Sword. Upon release in 2011, Skyward Sword was chained to the expectations of Zelda fans and decades of an established franchise. The invested parties in the game wanted certain things out of it, and the product that was shipped ended up just not being what a large group of people were hoping for. But Skyward Sword was my first Zelda game. And I didn't play it at release mired in the discourse, I just bought it and played it completely uninfluenced. And I loved it. And when the HD remaster came to Switch after Breath of the Wild had answered so many of the complaints people raised about Skyward Sword, the game was much better received. I heard a lot of people changing their minds on the game and more people being interested in the game and just appreciating what it wanted to be rather than what people wanted in 2011. Skyward Sword HD has some streamlining and quality of life tweaks, but it is largely the same game as it was. It's just better now because the context is different. Let's jump back over to PlayStation. The Last of Us is a sacred property for Sony and its fans are religious about it. But the sequel nearly started wars. But me? I played both games for the first time in January of 21. The only expectations I had of the original was that many people claimed it as a masterpiece. And indeed it is. I immediately ordered a copy of Part 2 after beating the game, and I knew that it ended up being controversial, but I never really knew why. I adored Part 2 and just couldn't fathom why people didn't like it. After diving into the conversation, I realized that the majority of it is people completely missing the point of the game and fundamentally misreading it or just having weird political issues with it. But there are a handful of arguments that I can understand that largely seem to stem from the fact that with all of the hype and build-up, so many people had expectations for the game that ultimately weren't aligned to what it was. And this is partially because of some deliberate misguiding on Naughty Dog's part in the marketing, but I think a lot of the people who didn't like the game for legitimate reasons, if they go back to it at any point, they'd probably like it a lot more now that the pressure of a new release is off. Without any of those expectations or pressure, my experience of the game was unadulterated. In my experience, the game was retrospective because I didn't play it at launch and only went back to it later. But what about games that disappointed me at first, but after having some time to cool off, I've grown to love? One of those games is Pikmin 3. Originally it came out on the Wii U, and I played it shortly after discovering the first Pikmin game. So I didn't technically play it at release, but when I did play it, I was expecting it to just be like Pikmin 1, but better, and there were a couple of things that just didn't click with me about it. I didn't love the 3 captains, and I remember the controls being a little bit hard for somebody who's left-handed, so I just didn't get too deep into it. But years later, I gave it another go when Deluxe hit Switch, and I loved it from start to finish. It's actually unthinkable that I didn't adore this game. Super Mario 3D World is in a slightly different position because I didn't even play it when it came out because I thought it looked just too similar to 3D Land, which I did like quite a lot, but it wasn't as compelling to me to pick up a similar experience on Wii U. When it re-released on Switch, I figured I should probably play it, and Bowser's Fury did look pretty cool, so I did, and ended up falling in love with it because my expectations and wants were just a little different after Mario Odyssey and some distance from 3D Land. Mario Maker 2 is similar to Spider-Man 2 in that I completely recognize that it builds on everything that the first game did and is pretty much just the preferable experience, but it just didn't have the same impact on me as the first did. And I think most people feel this way about Mario Maker 2. I haven't really turned around on it yet, and I don't know that I will because I think it's just actually not for me. But if I was more into making Mario levels and I went back to this game, I would appreciate it more. This is a compelling argument. Somewhat related is the kind of thing that happened with Metroid Prime Federation Force. At the time, Metroid was a franchise that was receiving so little attention, but fans were so hungry for more, that after years of waiting when the next Metroid Prime game was finally revealed, and it was this, people were a little upset. Personally, I have not played the game, but I do not remember anybody saying anything positive about it at launch. But years down the line, as people have started to go back and reflect on 3DS and its games, I've heard quite a few people come around on it, especially now that we have Metroid Dread, a Prime 1 remaster, and the promise of Prime 4. I expected F-Zero 99 to be a similar situation, but the game is so ridiculously fun that it's a non-issue. Now let's check back in on Spider-Man and Zelda. Spider-Man 2 is, on paper, everything that made the original great. Nuanced storytelling, great action, satisfying combat, and stupid fun traversal. But most of the side content is still uninteresting. It is better than the first 2 games, but it was the only major part of the experience that I thought really needed attention. So from that respect, it is honestly reasonable to be disappointed, and in my opinion, the original still has the better story. But even all of the things that have been greatly improved can't overcome that lingering feeling I had. And combat is way more fun in this game, and traversal is even more flexible, but the novelty is gone. I've already felt like Spider-Man, and this game doesn't reinvent that feeling, it just expands it, which isn't a bad thing. I've just played a lot of Spider-Man in the last few years. The OG in 2018, Miles Morales in 2020, remastered in 21, I've never had much distance from this formula. So to be playing that formula again in 2023, it's just not as magical. It's still really fun, but it's not magical. In a few years after I have some distance from it, I think I'll come back to Spider-Man 2 and have stupid fun web-slinging again. As for Tears of the Kingdom, my experience is similar, yet completely different. Again, in many ways, Tears of the Kingdom is objectively better on most metrics that you could possibly apply. And it is still magical. I've played it for like 80 hours, and it's actually insane how mechanically complicated and technically flawless this game is. It's impossibly large, flexible, and stable. By all accounts, it is a triumph. But I still just can't get rid of that itty-bitty part of me that isn't enamored by it like I was with Breath of the Wild. Waiting 6 years for a direct sequel is rough. Most new Zelda games have been made in that kind of time. The game is incredible, but it hasn't changed my life, which I know is a ridiculously unfair standard to hold it to, but the first one did. And I can look at the game as fairly and as critically as I want, but you just can't detach yourself from your experiences and desires. Especially as development times continue to grow, sequels wind up chasing answers to problems that are years old by the time the final product ships. Gamers want different things than they might have when the first game released. Forza Horizon 5 is interesting for me because the game is definitely the best Horizon experience, but I'm just a little tired of it. By every measure, it is a new and improved version of the game, and easily the entry I would point newcomers to, but for me at least, it's just not what I want anymore. I feel like I've explored everything that kind of experience has to offer me, and I probably won't go in for another one unless it gets reinvented in some way. I bring this up because a game can do everything right, be the perfect sequel on paper, flesh out what people love, change what they don't, and have nothing wrong with it, but in the time it takes to make that experience, people might just end up having a taste for something else. Which sucks. Now, this whole sequels are better in retrospect tagline is, of course, not a hard and fast rule. My main point is that your opinion of a sequel is so reliant on context and experience. Honestly, usually way more than the actual objective quality of a game. I mean, sequels just wouldn't exist if people didn't like them until a few years later. But especially in the last year, with God of War, Zelda, Spider-Man, and countless other high-profile IPs getting direct sequels to Game of the Year contenders, there has been so much debate around what sequels should be. People lately have been getting deeply upset about the reused content or reused world maps, and the reality is that sequels have always been developed like this. The thing is that as these development times get larger and larger, it starts to sting a little bit more after you wait 4 to 7 years to get a game that is iterative rather than innovative. Whereas in not so distant history, that kind of time span would have been enough for a brand new entry in a series or even two. This is just a transition period for how the industry operates, and people are feeling the growing pains. But what about you? I'm not just saying this to feed engagement, I am genuinely curious what your thoughts are on A, all of the sequels that I mentioned in this video, and B, just this kind of phenomenon. Is this something that you find in your own experience, or am I just completely crazy? If you like this video, there's a button for that. You can press it. So, there's a button for that. Subscribe.
Get your pitchforks ready, people, because these takes are coming